Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is there a way out of the Ukraine war, or is it doomed to go on with no end in sight? And if it is no end in sight, what are the implications for the United States? Let's get to the bottom line. In less than 100 days, the war in Ukraine has really slipped from the headlines, replaced in the United States at least by shooting massacres in different cities and worries about the skyrocketing price of gas, of peanut butter, baby formula, among many other items of everyday life. On the ground in Ukraine, though, Russia has expanded the amount of territory it controls. It's now at about 20% of the country, according to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Ukrainians in the neighborhood around them remain on edge, and the U.S. and its European allies continue to double down, thus far at least, on sanctions against Russia. And they're supplying Ukraine with increasingly powerful and sophisticated weapons. The Ukraine war has now become a marathon and not a Russian sprint. So with no signs of slowing down, where does this war go from here? Can it come to an end? Can it get far, far worse? What does a new forever proxy war mean for America and NATO? Today, we're talking with one of America's leading political scientists, John Mearsheimer, who is a distinguished service professor at the University of Chicago, and he's author of The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. Dr. Mearsheimer, it's great to be with you to discuss these issues. Let me just ask you, what is your perspective on how America is doing in managing its strategic priorities in the world and Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I think with regard to its strategic priorities in the world, it's not doing well at all. The fact is the United States faces a peer competitor, and it's not Russia, it's China. And the United States should be focusing laser-like on trying to contain China. But instead, what's happened is it's gotten into a major conflict with Russia in Eastern Europe. And if anything, we're increasing our force levels in Eastern Europe. And given that we have limited bandwidth, we want to spend a lot of time focusing on China and dealing with our allies in East Asia and not focusing on Eastern Europe and dealing with the Ukraine crisis. But of course, that's what we're doing. So we're in a lot of trouble in the sense that we've taken our eye off the most important threat facing us, which is China. And instead, we've helped create a threat in Eastern Europe that should not be a threat to the United States.
Well, there are two elements of that, John, that are very interesting to me. One is that when the Biden administration came in, of course, it was engineering the so-called pivot to Asia. It sent its Secretary of State, its National Security Advisor, and our Secretary of Defense from the United States to kind of wrestle with the Chinese over things. And it sort of seems like Vladimir Putin and Russia are saying, hey, remember me? I matter too. And we've seen the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the death of many tens of thousands of people, if not more. And I guess the question is, given that, what would have been the responsible way to deal with Russia and the aggressive steps it took in terms of going across the border of Ukraine, now killing so many people, and invading a country that is a member of the UN and is, apparently this is the greatest invasion of its kind since World War II.
Let me tell you what happened here. President Biden moved into the White House in January 2021. And for the rest of the year, that's 2021, he did what I would call an excellent job dealing with the China threat. The $64,000 question is what happened with regard to Russia and with regard to Ukraine? Joe Biden had handled the Ukraine portfolio in the Obama administration when he was vice president, and he was very hawkish. So after he came into the White House in January 2021, that hawkishness on Ukraine and on Russia reemerged, and he pursued a very hard-nosed policy towards Russia for all of 2021. And the end result is that relations between the United States and Russia over Ukraine got poisonous. And eventually that resulted in a war in February of this year. What the Biden administration should have done was moved away from trying to include Ukraine in NATO and instead tried to create a neutral Ukraine. But it didn't do that. It did exactly the opposite. And every time the Russians tried to cut some sort of deal on Ukraine, The Biden administration said no. And the end result is we have a war. We're deeply involved in that war now. And as I said earlier, it forces us to take our eye off the most important threat, which is China.
You received a lot of criticism for having blamed, being perceived to blame the United States for some of what happened with Ukraine. But our own CIA director, Bill Burns, when he was ambassador to Russia in 2008, wrote an email that said, wrote a report and said that when it comes to Ukraine joining NATO, that this would be a neuralgic issue for Russia and that we had to be prepared. So when you think back to 13 years ago, 14 years ago, 2008, around the time that NATO was expanding in its earliest phase and kind of going on and on, what should we have done early on not to end up back in an us versus them dynamic between NATO and its allies and Russia?
There's no question, Steve, that it was the April 2008 decision by NATO at Bucharest to say that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO at some point in the foreseeable future. This was when the die was cast. This was when we made a fatal mistake. And as you point out, Bill Burns, who was then the American ambassador in Moscow, he told Condoleezza Rice, who of course was Secretary of State, that Ukraine and NATO was the brightest of red lines for the Russian foreign policy elite. He made it very clear that this did not just include Vladimir Putin. Virtually everybody he talked to in the Russian elite was adamantly opposed to Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. Nevertheless, we continue to push to include Ukraine in NATO. And that led to the mess that we're in today. And this is why I say that the United States and NATO more generally is principally responsible for creating this crisis. Had we not pushed to include Ukraine in NATO in April 2008, if that issue had been taken off the table, then we wouldn't have the trouble today. In fact, Ukraine would still be intact, and I believe it would even include Crimea.
Now, you are a famous realist, and realists have an adage, which is you've got to see the world as it is and not the world as you want it to be. And the world as it is today is millions of Ukrainians have been displaced. Millions of Ukrainians are going across borders in there. You have a horrific war underway. The United States and its allies are providing more and more equipment and supplies to the Ukrainian forces. And by all accounts, President Zelensky and the Ukrainian military forces have done a rather remarkable job of resisting Russia's incursion in ways that I think no one expected, particularly after we saw what happened in Afghanistan. So given the world as it is today, where do you think the U.S. goes from here? Do you think we're doing the right thing? Do you think it can get a lot worse?
Well, the United States is so deeply committed at this point in time that there's no turning around in the foreseeable future. Basically, what we have here is a situation where Russia views what's happening in Ukraine as an existential threat. So the Russians cannot afford to lose in Ukraine. We are deeply committed not only to winning in Ukraine, but we are committed to using sanctions to weakening Russia to the point where we knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. So we, in effect, can't lose. They can't lose. There's no way that you can reach any kind of meaningful agreement in the foreseeable future. So the end result is that this war is going to go on, and we're going to continue to pour weapons into Ukraine and do everything we can to help them at least hold the line, and we believe maybe win the war in Ukraine. The Russians, on the other hand, because they feel they're facing an existential threat, are going to do everything possible, maybe using nuclear weapons, to make sure that they don't lose. So it's a rather hopeless situation.
Well, along these lines, I'd like to play a clip for you and our audience from Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin.
We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine.
So there he's saying you want to create real costs on Russia. I was with our NATO ambassador U.S. ambassador to NATO, Julianne Smith, recently, who said that we're actually seeking the strategic defeat of Russia in Ukraine, went a step further than Defense Secretary Austin. And along those lines, those are not just fighting words. Those are you saying stay in the game words and double down, double down, double down. It's very hard to back out of that. What, John, would the strategic defeat of Russia look like if that were to happen?
Well, I don't think we're talking about invading Russia. I think what we're talking about here is making sure that the Ukrainians decisively defeat the Russian military inside of Ukraine and recapture all their lost territory. That's point one. And point two, that we use economic sanctions to, in effect, wreck the Russian economy. And the end result of that is that you knock Russia out of the ranks of the great powers. This is something the Russians are not going to allow to happen. And Russia is a country that has thousands of nuclear warheads aimed at us. And the idea that you would be threatening to knock a great power out of the ranks of the great powers when that great power is armed with nuclear weapons seems to me to be the height of irresponsibility. I keep asking myself as I watch this crisis unfold and as I listen to people like the ambassador and the Secretary of Defense talk, what are they thinking? Where's John F. Kennedy? Have these people thought about how John F. Kennedy behaved during the Cuban Missile Crisis? He understood at the time that it was imperative that we do everything to end the crisis to make sure there was no nuclear war. These folks are pushing the Russians to the point where they're going to give them a very powerful incentive to at least think, if not use, nuclear weapons. In my opinion, this is just irresponsible.
So on the counterpoint to that, John, some were praising President Biden early on for showing restraint, of not letting Poland's MiG fighters to be transferred, of trying to send signals, as he's done recently, to President Zelensky that the provision of missiles came only with the absolute sacred pledge never to attack Russia, so that you could maintain this notion that America was sort of responsibly keeping this conflagration contained within Ukraine's borders and not at our doing, going over those borders. What grade would you give Joe Biden on restraint?
Well, I think there's no question when the conflict started, he exercised significant restraint. But the problem that we face is that as the war goes on, incentives come about to increase the amount of aid that we give to the Ukrainians. It's kind of like salami tactics. And what's happened here is we've given more and more and more aid to the Ukrainians. We're getting deeper and deeper into the war. One could argue we've effectively declared war against Russia, and we're just letting the Ukrainians do the fighting. So it's very hard to say where the escalation stops in this war. Because as we escalate, the Russians escalate as well. We've just promised that we, the Americans and the British, would give them long-range, multiple launching rocket systems that can go deep into Ukraine and maybe into Russia. Putin has made it clear, Lavrov has made it clear that they will respond to that. So you have this real tit for tat taking place. And where it all ends up is very hard to say. But restraint is slowly but steadily going out the window.
Well, I do believe that the majority of observers and media that do this are framing it in terms of a fight for democracy that we're watching and observing. What do you think of that framing?
I think it doesn't make good sense. I think you want to think about this crisis as basically a geopolitical crisis involving the United States and Russia. The fact is that we pushed NATO right up to Russia's doorstep, and the Russians said that this was unacceptable. This is a good old-fashioned realist argument. And if you're in the business of thinking that you can spread democracy around the world the way the United States tends to think it can do, and that other countries are not going to push back because realism or realpolitik doesn't matter anymore. And all that really matters is the distinction between democracy and authoritarian states. You're going to get yourself into a whole heck of a lot of trouble. And that's what's happened here. So I think it just doesn't make sense to look at it in those terms. And again, I would emphasize that the principal threat the United States faces in the world today is not Russia. Russia can barely handle the Ukrainian military. It barely could handle the Georgian military in 2008. This is not a country that looks anything like the Soviet Union did after World War II. We do have a peer competitor. It's called China, and we better be concentrating our efforts on containing China and not getting involved in a messy war in Eastern Europe with Russia.
John, a lot of policymakers around the world secretly read your articles. They may not want to be seen doing that because you're a controversial character, you know, in some quarters in this. But, you know, people read you, they listen to you, they reach out to you. Folks from Europe do. And I guess given your level of awareness about these institutions or what are going on, I'm really interested in the solvency of NATO right now. That I've just returned from a trip from Europe. And there's this kind of two layers. You know, in Japanese, you'd call it tatemae and honne. The tatemae, the surface is NATO is reborn, repurposed, revitalized because of the attack of Ukraine and now a new purpose. The honne, the reality is there's a lot of doubt in that relationship. They're not certain whether the United States is going to be with its allies in dark days or not. And as they look at January 6th, they look at the toxicity in American politics. They look at, you know, a few years of Donald Trump, who wanted to remove America from a number of these institutions. They're not sure how steady America is. What is your sense about the solvency of NATO today?
Well, just to embellish your point on NATO, you also want to remember that if we have a major crisis in East Asia involving China, America's focus will shift from Ukraine and the Russian problem to China very quickly. So there is that in addition to all the factors that you pointed out. I would also note, Steve, that if you look inside NATO, there are powerful centrifugal forces at play. If you listen to Macron talk about how we should deal with Putin, he is basically saying we don't want to humiliate Putin. What we want to do is we want to give him an off-ramp. We want to be able to negotiate with him. The Ukrainians find this unacceptable, but more importantly, the East Europeans find this unacceptable, and I believe the Biden administration finds it unacceptable. So you see cleavages within NATO that will only grow with time, and you see problems down the road between the United States and its European allies. So this, I think, over time will become a messier and messier situation.
Well, let's listen to President Biden on his recent views on Ukraine.
It's their territory. I'm not going to tell them what they should and shouldn't do. But it appears to me that at some point along the line, there's a settlement here. And what that entails, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows at the time. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to put the Ukrainians in a position where they can defend themselves.
John, is President Biden reading Mearsheimer? This is the first time I've heard him talk about a negotiated off-ramp, much like you spoke about.
It's very hard to say whether he believes what he's saying. I mean, obviously, this war is going to end with some form of negotiated settlement. But what that negotiated settlement looks like is very hard to say at this point in time. I believe that the Biden administration wants to inflict a decisive defeat on Russia inside of Ukraine, and it wants to weaken Russia with sanctions. And I don't think the Biden administration at this point in time is interested in a negotiated settlement. And the reason is that a negotiated settlement would involve making major concessions to the Russians. And the Biden administration, given its rhetoric, is not in a position where it can make major concessions to the Russians. So the situation on the battlefield has got to change a lot more over time before a negotiated settlement is a viable alternative. So my sense is that President Biden is just saying this for public relations purposes.
You know, China is a topic you've mentioned many times, and I'm fascinated by what whether Joe Biden is, engaging in something smart or not in terms of Taiwan, making the comment that should there be military activity with Taiwan, that the United States would militarily come to their defense, and thus ending the strategic ambiguity over Taiwan until the White House walked back President Biden's comments. So it's now created this question of what's real policy. What are your views about that step that the president took in responding to China?
Let me make 2 points, Steve. First of all, I think that we have to defend Taiwan. I think there's no question about that. For strategic reasons, it would be disastrous for our alliance structure in East Asia if we were not to defend Taiwan. And further, Taiwan is important militarily if you're interested in bottling up the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Air Force inside the first island chain. And we are interested in doing that. So we're going to defend Taiwan. I think what Biden has done is actually quite smart. He's said that the policy has changed, in effect, by saying he will come to the defense of Taiwan axiomatically. And then, of course, the White House walks that back and says that really policy hasn't changed. It's clear that we're inching towards a change in the policy, but not really changing the policy. We don't want to anger the Chinese too much, and I think that's smart. But we do at the same time want to make it clear to them that we will defend Taiwan. And I think Biden has done a good job on that. So I would give him an A grade for his handling of the China threat on that dimension.
Let me just ask you finally, I sort of look at power in the world as sort of like the stock market, that power is a function of future expectations. And if you measure power as a function of future expectations, which portfolio is doing better right now, China's or America's?
Well, I have a different view of power, Steve. I view power mainly in terms of material capabilities. And what I care about are 2 things: the size of your population and how much wealth you have. And what makes China so threatening today is its incredibly dynamic economy. The fact that in terms of cutting edge technologies, it's right out there with the United States. And we fear that over time, they'll overtake us. They'll become the leading country in the world in terms of developing new technologies. They'll become much wealthier than us. And as you know, they already have a much bigger population. So if the United States is up against a country with more people and more wealth, it's in deep trouble. And this is why China is such a formidable adversary. We're doing everything we can to head that problem off at the pass by, making changes in how we do business here in the United States. And hopefully the Chinese will make a number of mistakes regarding their own economy, and they'll do things to weaken their economy, and they'll hit the flat of the curve, and we'll be in much better shape moving forward. But that's not for sure.
Well, Dr. John Mearsheimer, I really appreciate your willingness to provoke our thinking into bigger ways, into different angles of these sets of challenges today. Thanks so much for joining us. University of Chicago professor of political science, John Mearsheimer. Thank you.
My pleasure, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Buckle up, folks. Things are going to get a lot worse. According to my guest today, who's one of the world's leading thinkers from the Realist School of Foreign Policy, here's how things are going to go down. 1, America's going to invest deeply in trying to create strategic defeat for Russia and Ukraine. And 2, this will distract from China, which actually is a true peer competitor to the United States, unlike Russia. The result will be a dangerous and potentially crippling effect on America's status and place in the world, its alliances, and its ability to get its way. We can take bets on whether John Mearsheimer is right or wrong, but if he is right, we're talking about a big turning point in history, just like the war in Suez, Egypt in 1956. Back then, the power and prestige of the United Kingdom came crashing down once and for all. It's happened before to powerful, overextended empires that lost their focus, and it can happen again. And that's the bottom line.